In this video, we're going to take a deeper dive into anomaly detection. In previous videos, you've seen some of the basics of what anomalies are and why they matter, and maybe a few guiding ideas such as distance, density, and reconstruction. I invite you to watch those videos if you aren't familiar with those terms or need a refresher on those terms. Today we're going to build on that foundation, and instead of staying at that high level, we're going to work our way into some actual methods, add some vocabulary that comes up in real research and practice. And when I say going deeper, I don't mean we're jumping into graduate level linear algebra proofs. Instead, we're going to move beyond everyday metaphors to actual terms and algorithms that security analysts, data scientists, and researchers use. Acronyms will appear, of course, but we're going to expand them as we go and explain their role. So hopefully you won't feel lost after watching this video. Let's begin with a quick recap of the main categories of anomalies, because these terms will come up elsewhere in the lecture and beyond. First category is a point anomaly. It's the simplest case. Imagine you're looking at thousands of user login times and they all cluster between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. Well, then suddenly one user account logs in at 3 in the morning from a different continent. That event stands out as a single, isolated oddball. That's a point anomaly. Second category is contextual anomaly. Here's something is unusual, not in general, but in a specific context. Suppose a financial analyst downloads large spreadsheets every day. For that person, downloading a 50 meg file is perfectly normal. But if an intern in the HR department suddenly downloads a 50 meg spreadsheet filled with salary information, well, that same event is definitely abnormal in that context. That's why we call it a contextual anomaly. Contextual anomalies depend heavily on who, when, and under what circumstances the behavior occurs. Third category is collective anomaly. This occurs when a group of events taken together form a suspicious pattern. For example, one failed login attempt might not mean anything, but 200 failed logins in 5 minutes from the same source tells a very different story. Likely a brute force password attack. Collectively, those events reveal an anomaly. Understanding these three categories, point, contextual, and collective, is essential because they shape how we design our detection methods and how we interpret alerts in a security operations center. Now that we've defined anomalies, let's talk about the flip side. What does it mean to be normal? In everyday speech, normal just means typical, but in anomaly detection, we often need a more formal definition. One common way to formalize normality is through probability distributions. If you've taken statistics course, you might remember the bell curve or other distributions within there, and those values help to cluster around the mean, around the average, with fewer values appearing farther outside in the tails. Under this model, something that falls very outside on one of the tails has a very low probability of being generated by the same process. That low probability is our flag. This might be an anomaly. The probability distribution approach works well when the data fits neat statistical assumptions. Unfortunately, real-world cybersecurity data often doesn't follow a perfect bell curve. Network traffic can be bursty, logins can vary widely, attack behavior can overlap with legitimate but unusual behavior. Still, probability-based thinking provides a solid foundation. Normal equals high probability under our model, and an anomaly equals low probability. Keep this mental model in mind as we move forward. Whether we're using distances, densities, or reconstructions at some level, we're always comparing how likely or unlikely something is relative to what we expect. First family of methods that we'll dive into are statistical approaches. These are the oldest and most intuitive ways of detecting anomalies. Common tool here is the z-score, which measures how many standard deviations a value is from the mean. For example, if the average login session length is 30 minutes with a standard deviation of 5 minutes, then a session lasting 55 minutes has a z-score of 5. It's 5 standard deviations away. Statistically, that's extremely unlikely if the data follows a normal distribution. A high z-score can therefore be flagged as an anomaly. Another statistical tool is confidence intervals. Suppose we expect 95% of normal data to fall within a certain range. Anything outside of that interval can be considered suspicious. The strength of statistical methods is their simplicity and interoperability. They're easy to calculate, easy to explain, and quick to implement. However, their weakness is that they rely on assumptions about the data distribution. If your data isn't bell-shaped, or if it has multiple peaks and valleys, simple z-scores might not be accurate. But despite their limits, statistical approaches remain popular in baseline anomaly detection, especially when the data is low-dimensional and relatively well-behaved. Next up are distance-based methods. The idea here is straightforward. If a data point is far away from others, it may be an outlier. To make this work, we need a way to measure distance or similarity between points. The most common metric is Euclidean distance, which is the straight line distance between 2 points in a space. For example, if you imagine each data record as a point in a multi-dimensional space where each feature is one axis, then normal points cluster together and outliers sit far away. Another common metric is cosine similarity. Instead of measuring distance directly, cosine similarity looks at the angle between two vectors. This is especially useful when the magnitude of data points doesn't matter as much as their direction. For instance, in text analysis, two documents may have very different lengths, but if their word frequency patterns point in the same direction, then they're considered similar. That's the type of thing that we use, or at least some methods use, to detect whether AI has written a paper or whether AI has written an answer. If the answer is AI generated versus normal generation that one might have when they're writing a response by hand or manually. In cybersecurity, distance-based methods can highlight unusual events like a network session with far more packets than normal, or a login with activity patterns unlike any others. Their main drawback is that they can become less reliable as the number of features grows, something that we're going to revisit when we talk about the curse of dimensionality. A classic distance-based technique is k-nearest neighbors, or KNN approach. The idea is simple. For each point, compute the distance to its k closest neighbors. If that average distance is much larger than what's typical, then that point would be considered an anomaly. Let's walk through an example. Suppose k is 5, k equals 5. For each login event, we calculate its similarity to the 5 most similar logins. If a login has close neighbors, meaning it looks similar to the other logins, then it's normal. But if its 5 nearest neighbors are all far away, it's probably anomalous. The KNN approach is intuitive and requires very few assumptions about the data. It doesn't require training a complex model, and it adapts naturally as new data comes in. However, the major downside is computational cost. To calculate distances for every point against every other point in a large data set can be extremely expensive. Imagine comparing millions of logins to millions of other logins in real time, or attempting to do that in real time. That's billions of distance calculations. Despite this cost, KNN remains a widely taught and used baseline in anomaly detection, especially when data sets are modest in size. Another powerful family of approaches focuses on density, meaning how crowded or sparse a region of data is. The intuition is simple. Normal data tends to live in dense neighborhoods, while anomalies live in sparse, isolated areas. One well-known algorithm here is local outlier factor, often abbreviated LOF. LOF compares the density of a point to the density of its neighbors. If a point is much less dense than the points around it, it gets high outlier score. Another major algorithm is DBSCAN, which stands for Density-Based Spatial Clustering of Applications with Noise. DBSCAN groups points into dense clusters, and anything left over, the points that don't fit well with any cluster, are treated as noise or anomalies. These methods are especially useful for cybersecurity data where attacks may form their own sparse clusters or may stand alone outside normal activity. For example, insider threat activity might appear as a small, low-density region in user behavior space. The strength of density-based methods is that they handle irregular, nonlinear data well. Their weakness is that they require careful tuning of parameters like neighborhood size or density threshold, which can vary dramatically depending on the data set. Closely related to density-based methods is the use of clustering. Clustering means grouping data into clusters of similar items. In anomaly detection, clusters represent groups of normal data, and anomalies are the points that either don't belong to any cluster or form very small isolated clusters. For example, suppose you cluster network traffic by protocol, packet size, and timing. Those three features, you might find that web browsing, email, and video streaming form large clusters. But then there's a tiny cluster that represents unusual tunneling activity over DNS, the domain name system. That small cluster could be an anomaly worth investigating. Clustering is particularly attractive when you have no labels at all. It lets the structure of data emerge naturally. However, the challenge is that not all clusters are meaningful. Some may just be artifacts of noise. Also, clustering algorithms like k-means assume that clusters are round and evenly sized, which may not reflect reality. Despite these caveats, clustering remains a core, unsupervised tool, and it often serves as a first step in exploratory analysis of anomalies. Our next family of methods is reconstruction-based detection. The logic here is slightly different. Instead of looking at distances or densities, we train a model to reconstruct what normal data looks like. Then, when we feed new data into the model, we check how well it can be reconstructed. If the error is high, meaning the model struggles to recreate it, then the new data is considered anomalous. Two of the most common reconstruction approaches are principal component analysis, which is abbreviated PCA, and autoencoders, a type of deep learning neural network. Reconstruction-based methods are powerful because they can capture complex patterns in normal data, which we frequently have in cybersecurity. Reconstruction-based methods are also powerful because they're useful in high-dimensional spaces where distance-based methods start to fail. However, they require training and are more computationally intensive than other methods. Reconstruction-based methods can also be sensitive to how well the training data represents our idea of normal. If your training set accidentally includes attacks, then your model may learn to consider attacks as normal, which undermines detection. Let's dive deeper and look more closely at principal component analysis, or PCA. This is a technique for reducing the dimensionality of data. Imagine you have dozens or even hundreds of features describing each network session, the nightmare of dimensionality that we often have in cybersecurity with the amount of data that we have. So if we have hundreds of features that describe a network session, like packet counts, durations, flags, protocols, maybe byte sizes, and so on, PCA identifies the combination of feature called components, the combinations of those features or those components that capture the most variance in the data. By projecting the data onto these components, we can reconstruct most of the original information using fewer dimensions. If a new point fits well within the lower dimensional reconstruction, it's likely normal. But if that error is large when we attempt reconstruction, it means PCA can't represent it accurately, and it may be an anomaly. In cybersecurity, PCA can highlight traffic patterns that don't align with established norms, even if those patterns involve subtle relationships along many features. The trade-off is that PCA is a linear method. It assumes that the relationships in the data can be captured with straight-line combinations of features. Nonlinear anomalies may require more flexible models, which brings us to autoencoders. An autoencoder is a special type of neural network designed to learn compressed representations of data. It consists of two main parts: an encoder that compresses the input into a smaller representation, and a decoder that reconstructs the input from that compressed form. During training, the autoencoder learns to minimize the difference between the input and the reconstructed output. If you train an autoencoder only on normal data, it becomes very good at reconstructing normal patterns. But when you feed it an anomaly, something that it's never seen, the reconstruction error will be large. That error becomes the signal for detection. Autoencoders are powerful because they can model nonlinear relationships, something PCA cannot. They can capture complex structures in user behavior, network traffic, or system logs. However, autoencoders require more computational resources and more careful tuning. They can also be prone to overfitting, meaning they memorize the training data rather than generalize well. Despite these challenges, autoencoders are increasingly common in modern cybersecurity, and especially in anomaly detection systems, particularly where deep learning infrastructure is available. Let's talk more about that curse of dimensionality. Before we wrap things up here, we need to discuss that because it's a fundamental challenge. In low-dimensional spaces, say 2 or 3 dimensions, 2 or 3 features, 2 or 3 things that we're looking at, distances are intuitive. We can see which points are close and which are far. But in very high-dimensional spaces, like a data set with hundreds of features, distances become less meaningful. It turns out that as dimensions grow, all points start to look roughly the same distance apart. The distinction between near and far essentially collapses in high-dimensional spaces. This has direct impact on distance-based anomaly detection. If every single point is equally far from every other point, then how do we decide if it's an outlier? Similarly, density estimates become unreliable because the data is spread so thin across high-dimensional space. This is one reason why dimensionality reduction techniques like PCA and autoencoders are so important. They compress high-dimensional data into fewer, more informative dimensions, restoring the ability to meaningfully measure distance, density, or reconstruction error. Let's conclude then by pulling everything together. Anomaly detection comes in several methodological families: statistical approaches like z-score and confidence intervals, distance-based approaches like Euclidean distance or cosine similarity, or maybe k-nearest neighbors, are all important for distance-based approaches. Density-based approaches like local outlier factor or LOF or DBSCAN, and reconstruction-based approaches like PCA, principal component analysis, and autoencoders. Each method has its strengths. Statistical methods are simple and interpretable. Distance-based methods are intuitive. Density-based methods capture local patterns. Reconstruction-based methods shine in high-dimensional data. But each method can also have weaknesses, from reliance on assumptions to computational cost, maybe its parameter, sensitivity, and vulnerability to the curse of dimensionality. The critical point is that anomaly detection is not about one perfect algorithm, it's about choosing the right tool for the problem at hand. In cybersecurity, anomalies may reveal zero-day attacks, insider threats, or fraud, but they may also just be unusual yet harmless behavior. Balancing detection power with false positive management is the real challenge for cybersecurity and AI. As you move forward, keep building on that intuition. What does normal look like for the system that you analyze? And which method exposes the unusual? That mindset will serve you far more than memorizing names of algorithms. As you move forward, keep building your intuition. What does normal look like for the system that you're analyzing? And which method best exposes the unusual? You'll have to try a combination of several methods often until you get some of that intuition in practice with cybersecurity data sets and applying AI and statistical methods and some of the other methods to those data sets. As you move forward, keep building your intuition. What does normal look like for the system you're analyzing, and which method best exposes the unusual? You might need to try more than one method, and you might need to try different data sets and different approaches in order to get the model and build and learn from that model. Build that intuition on what normal looks like. Many systems are different. Local knowledge is better than remote knowledge. And learning as you go and practicing with the methods is definitely helpful as you move forward learning about both AI and cybersecurity. Thanks for watching.